Well, what better place to start than with Twilight of the Idols, Skirmishes of an Untimely Man, section 38, which Nietzsche explicitly titles My Conception of Freedom. Here's how he introduces and explicates that concept, and I quote, "Liberal institutions cease to be liberal as soon as they are attained. Later on, there are no worse and no more thorough injurers of freedom than liberal institutions. Their effects are known well enough. They undermine the will to power. They level mountain and valley and call that morality. They make men small, cowardly, and hedonistic. Every time it is the herd animal that triumphs with them. Liberalism, in other words, herd animalization." Now, the introduction to his conception of freedom seems clear. One undermines freedom by making, quote, men small, cowardly, and hedonistic. Philosophical and religious traditions have had many views of freedom, to be sure, but I am not aware of any in which being big, brave, and indifferent to suffering loomed large. Yet that appears to be the concept of freedom Nietzsche invokes here. The passage continues. "These same liberal institutions produce different effects while they are still being fought for. Then they really promote freedom in a powerful way. On closer inspection, it is war that produces these effects, the war for liberal institutions. War educates freedom. For what is freedom? That one has the will to assume responsibility for oneself, that one maintains the distance which separates us, that one becomes more indifferent to difficulties, hardships, privation, even to life itself, that one is prepared to sacrifice human beings for one's cause, not excluding oneself. Freedom means that the manly instincts which delight in war and victory dominate over other instincts, for example, over those of happiness. The human being who has become free, and much more the spirit who has become free, spits on the contemptible type of well-being dreamed of by shopkeepers, Christians, cows, females, Englishmen, and other Democrats. The free man is a warrior. The frei Mensch is Krieger." And we're going to come back to that phrase. So, assuming responsibility for oneself is, of course, not quite the same thing as actually being responsible for one's actions. The former is an attitude, a disposition, namely that of the warrior, we find out. There is no sense, ordinary or philosophical, in which freedom means pleasure in warfare. The warriors are, to be sure, usually thought to be big, brave, and indifferent to suffering. This is quite clearly, I think, persuasive definition in the sense Stevenson identified many decades ago. In section 41 of the same chapter from Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche then describes the, quote, freedom which I do not mean, namely, here's his explanation, abandonment to one's instincts. Today, the claim for independence, for free development, for laissez-aller is pressed most hotly by the very people for whom no reins would be too strict. That is a symptom of decadence. Our modern conception of freedom is one more proof of the degeneration of the instincts. So in other words, Nietzsche renounces one of the colloquial connotations of the idea of freedom, namely freedom from constraints. The point here is obviously of a piece with the concern in Beyond Good and Evil. This is section 188, where Nietzsche says, and I quote, "Everything there is or was of freedom, subtlety, boldness, dance, or masterly assurance on earth, whether in thinking itself, or in ruling, or in speaking and persuading, in artistic just as in ethical practices, has only developed by virtue of the tyranny of such arbitrary laws. Every artist knows how far removed from this feeling of letting go, laissez-aller, is from his most natural state, the free ordering, placing, disposing, and shaping in the moment of inspiration. He knows how strict and subtly he obeys thousands of laws at this very moment, laws that defy conceptual formulation precisely because of their hardness and determinedness." So freedom in Nietzsche's sense does not mean freedom from constraint, but its opposite, being subject to hard and determinate laws. Section 213 of Beyond Good and Evil continues this line of thought, and I quote again, "Artists are the ones who know only too well that their feeling of freedom, finesse, and authority, of creation, formation, and control only reaches its apex when they have stopped doing anything voluntarily and instead do everything necessarily. In short, they know that inside themselves necessity and, quote, freedom of the will have become one." Notice that freedom of the will is placed in quotes by Nietzsche himself in this passage. It's not, after all, real freedom of the will, since it involves nothing voluntary. That's what he tells us. Only action which is necessary. Actions bound, as he says in the earlier passage, by hard laws. These passages resonate in turn with the famous section 335 of the Gay Science, which appears to suggest that people can create themselves. Here is the bit of the passage emphasized by Pollner and Miles in their exposition of Nietzsche's positive conception of freedom. And I quote, "We want to become who we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves." Yet this passage then continues as follows, and this is the continuation upon which most scholars are, alas, silent, but I am always vocal, and here it is. To that end of creating ourselves, we must become the best learners and discoverers of everything that is lawful and necessary in the world. We must become physicists in order to be creators in this sense, while hitherto all valuations and ideals have been based on ignorance of physics. Therefore, long live physics. So creation in this sense is a very special sense indeed, for it presupposes the discovery of what is lawful and necessary as revealed by the physical sciences. And this, of course, recalls the earlier theme about the equivalence of freedom and necessity. In context, what Nietzsche has in mind becomes clearer, for in the preceding part of section 335, he explains that while the particular cause of any action is indemonstrable, we do know that values are, quote, among the most powerful levers in the involved mechanisms of our actions. Thus, the task for the sciences is to discover the laws of cause and effect governing particular values and particular actions, a more refined version of the task that Nietzsche later calls for in the note at the end of the first essay of the genealogy, namely for the human sciences to examine the effects of different kinds of valuations on the good of the majority and the good of the minority, as he puts it there.